Let me start this by asking you a question. What are some non-living things that you consider valuable? Is it money? Is it food, gold, or some other valuable object? Well, those are some very common answers, right? What if I told you that one of the most important thing in our life is information? Well, that's kind of a surprising answer, right? But it's actually true. Information is a thing that can give you an advantage in many different situations. For example, let's say it can bring you money, it can provide you comfort, it can also help you to gain an advantage over your competitors in this competitive world. Having information is also insanely helpful in business sectors. However, the intrinsic value of information really depends on the correctness of it. When, let's say, information is changed or modified from the correct one, it can actually cause huge damage in the long run instead of being helpful. Wrong information such as this may cause people to go violent, may make them lose their money, or may cause their general beliefs to change. Whether this information is right or wrong, it is actually quite important to maintain information carefully, as information can spread really fast in this digital age. And also, lately, it is very easy to pass information from one person to another, as we are basically closer than ever in various social media networks. In these social media websites, you can see others' information quite easily. We can talk to other or chat to others very easily, and we can even share others' information for everyone to see. So, in case of these digital medias, information propagates really easily over time. And in this lecture, that will be our topic. So, basically, we are going to talk about propagation of information and misinformation. So, at first, let's take an overview on this lecture. In this lecture, at first we are going to talk about the definition of information and how it differs from general data. Then we are going to talk about the different methods of collecting information, and we are going to take a look at some basic uses of information in general. Once we are done, then we are going to talk about the nature of information spread, how information is spread from one person to another, the overall direction of information flow, and we are going to see this flow of information in different types of graphs. Also, we are going to talk about the significance of these graphs. Alongside understanding these graphs, we are going to see how to plot them and study some information propagation trend and theory in social networks. After that, we are going to talk about digitization of information and its overall effect. And then we are going to talk about misinformation propagation and the general effect it causes. Then we are going to provide some examples on misinformation propagation, and finally we are going to talk about some preventive measure of misinformation propagation. There are also various approaches in computer science to prevent misinformation propagation, and we are going to talk about some of them to end the lecture. Now let's begin this by talking about what is information. As you can see here, information is data that is processed to make it meaningful and useful. So information is basically a meaningful and useful version of data, and there are some distinct differences between them. Data is actually raw and comes unorganized. Some example of data is the Facebook posts you see around, the Twitter posts you see in your Twitter feed. Also, every bit of news and articles you see on various websites is also data. These data are usually arranged quite haphazardly, and these are not very useful in its basic form because they are not organized. However, most of the time we can interpret this data in some useful context. Let's see an example. Let's say you in Twitter you can see bunch of posts related to a recent election that is going to happen. Now we are going into guesswork right now. So there are a bunch of posts about a recent election. Now those posts alone are not very useful. However, if one manages to figure out the overall sentiment that people have towards that election, those tweets suddenly become useful for them. Not always useful, but can become useful. For example, one can figure out how many people are against the election and how many people are actually in favor of the election, and so on. So when someone has this sort of data, he or she can come up with different follow-up strategies. For example, the target audiences that are not satisfied with the election can be focused, and one can provide them various positive sides of the election to convince them accordingly. So in this case, the information is actually being put into use. Let's talk about another example. Let's say there is a class with a bunch of students and you have the test scores of those students in your hands. Now, those test scores alone may not be very useful. However, if you figure out the percentage of pass and fails from those test scores, that data suddenly becomes concise, short, and meaningful. From that percentage of pass and fail, you can actually measure the success rate of a teacher in the class. Additionally, the students who actually failed can be separated and the teacher can take extra care of them while teaching. Another thing you need to keep in mind that the nature of information conversion depends on the context and also depends on the person who are going to use that information. Now, the overall percentage of pass and fail, as we discussed earlier, this overall percentage might be useful to you if you are the teacher in the class. However, if you are the students of that class, you don't really need the percentage of pass and fail, right? It won't be that much useful in this case. So paying a student, in this case, if you actually figure out the overall standing of yourself in the class instead, then the data might suddenly become useful for you, as you can actually evaluate yourself against the others. As you can see, like this, different people interpret information differently depending on the use of the information that they are going to have. And this is how you can convert data into information and put them in some good use. So in this way, you can say that all information is data, but not all data is information. As you can see, data collection is not very difficult. You can throw a bunch of sentences and that becomes data. You can collect a bunch of sentences that was thrown by people and that is also data. However, when you try to make the data and make this data meaningful and useful, then you have some work to do. So information collection requires some work. And there are various different methods to collect information. Now let's talk about different methods of information collection in this part. There are various ways of collecting information, and one of them is by observing data. I'm going to give you an example here to make it more intuitive to you. Let's say you want to measure the effect of smoking cigarettes in general population. In this case, what you can do is to collect a bunch of people who are addicted to smoking, observe their condition some days while they are regularly smoking. After some days, you can perform some medical diagnosis on them and produce a health report based on the condition of those people. Then you can interpret that health report and turn it into information. Here, you are turning some non-quantifiable bits of information, such as health condition from smoking cigarettes, into quantifiable and useful information. This is one useful way of getting data, but this particular approach has some flaws in it. For example, information produced in this way may get influenced by personal bias. If we see this with an example, let's say for your observation, you may prefer middle-aged people because they can be handled fairly easily. But the effect on them of smoking cigarette will definitely not be as severe as it would be on some older people. As a result, if you collect all the middle-aged people for your observation, the information you collect may become biased and it may not represent the overall population, which also consists of older people and younger people. Additionally, this interpretation of health report may vary from person to person. A heartbeat rate of 85 beats per minute might be normal for you, but not so normal for some other people. So when you collect information by observation, you need to be careful and you need to make sure that your observation doesn't get influenced by personal bias. And this way you can ensure healthy and correct information from observation. Now let's move on to a second type of information collection method, which is experiments. Now experiment is kind of similar to observation, but there are some distinct differences between them. When we talked about observation, we did not talk about any type of grouping, right? What we did was just collecting some people and observe the effect of smoking cigarettes on them. However, when you try to experiment, you need to divide up people into groups. Let's talk about our previous example again. When you try to do experiment, I mean previous example in sense that is smoking cigarette example. So when you try to do experiment, in this case, you would need to have two sets of groups. One of these groups would smoke cigarette regularly and other would not. And after a few days of watching these groups, you would measure the differences between smoking and non-smoking people to produce the health report. So here among the two groups, one of them was the control group, which consisted of people who smoked no cigarette, and another one was test group, which consisted of people who smoked cigarettes. So you are gaining this information through control over variable. You divided up people into groups and you controlled the nature of those groups. In this case, the control was whether they are smoking or not. Now, this information of collecting information come with its own flaws. Here, the quality of the information depends on the design of the experiment. For example, in order to ensure proper information, you need to make sure that both the control group and the test group have the same type of population. If a control group mostly consists of older people and the test group mostly consists of younger people, then the information gained from the experiment won't be quite correct, right? So the overall design of the research has to be proper in order to gain different results from experiments. The third method of collecting information is through surveys. Now, you guys should already have some idea on how surveys work since we often participate in them in real life very regularly. Now, surveys usually come with a bunch of questionnaires which collects information from interested people on specific aspects. One good example is the teaching evaluation form. The teaching evaluation form that you fill up each semester is a type of survey. In order to design a good survey, you need to come up with appropriate set of questions. Also, a survey can be both anonymous or non-anonymous depending on the goal of the survey. Another method of information collection is subjective estimation. Subjective estimation is gathered based on the subjective view of an expert on a particular topic. In television programs or news, we often see subjective estimation from experts on different political or economical aspects. However, as the name suggests, this estimation is completely subjective and highly dependent on personal bias and preferences. So this approach of information collection is only adopted when there are no other information collection method that works quite well. The fifth type of information collection method that we are going to discuss is interview systems. Interview procedures are kind of similar to surveys in a way that interviews are also taken through a set of questions. Like in surveys, we have questions. During interviews, we also ask questions. However, interview questions are rather unorganized and these questions are asked on individual basis. Due to that, these interviews actually take quite a bit of time and information collected from these interviews are quite unorganized. So after the interview, they are needed to be reorganized and cleaned. Therefore, as this actually takes quite a bit of time, this interview approach is not really suitable when you try to collect data from a large population of people because interview is performed on individual basis, right? So when you are asking questionnaires from a large population of people, it might be more helpful to rely on surveys instead of interviews. And finally, when you are unable to connect data using any structured approach, you can always rely on existing sources to collect data. There is a humongous amount of data that is spread across different publications, government agency information, social media, transaction record, different organization, and many other sources. All of these data can be collected with proper permission and can be used for specific need. However, most of these data come with lots of unnecessary extra information alongside, and cleaning up those information might be a tedious task. Therefore, when you are collecting data from existing sources, data cleaning and processing is a huge part of it. So there are these various ways with which you can collect information.